hours and are destroyed. 2 hours later, SS troops throw back a regiment of Soviet T-34 tanks. Zhukov's defensive battle plan appears to be on the brink of disaster. Then the two armies lock together at Prokhorovka. Prokhorovka is the biggest tank battle ever fought. On it, everything will depend. At Prokhorovka, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, with around 850 tanks and self-propelled guns, is pitted against the 2nd SS Panzer Corps with some 600. The German Tiger tanks, with their powerful 88mm main guns, outrange the Soviet T-34s. The Soviet tanks are forced to close in. Individual Soviet soldiers attack the German tanks face to face with satchel charges and hollow charge grenades. The smoke of burning tanks hangs like a fog. One by one, Hitler's seemingly formidable tanks are knocked out. By day's end, German General Hoth has lost more than 350 tanks and assault guns and 10,000 troops. Soviet losses are higher, but Zhukov's battle plan has held and stopped the breakthrough. And now at Kursk, it is time for Zhukov to unleash his counterattack. But like German Field Marshal von Hindenburg at Cambrai, this means he must address the last requirement in the battle plan for defensive battle: realism. Commanders must be realistic about their objectives and not overstretch themselves.
One of the most important aspects of the counter-strike plan will be how far that counter-strike should push before coming to its end, before coming to its culminating point. The last thing that a commander launching a counter-strike would want is to find himself at the end of a tenuous line of communication and vulnerable to a counter-strike himself.
At Cambrai, 10 days after the beginning of their initial offensive, the British are exhausted. Their lines of communication are stretched, and they're still struggling in a network of German defensive positions. Von Hindenburg's generals launched their counterattack with an hour-long bombardment. They focus on the southern end of the British line, where the British are at their weakest. Infantry assault groups infiltrate through areas weakened by the artillery, bypass British strongpoints, and deal with British guns thought to be safe in the rear. By 10:30 hours, the German counterattack has pushed 8 miles into the southern British sector, well beyond the original British line before the November 20th offensive.
They use innovative new tactics, specialist counter-attacking troops with new technology, machine pistols and flamethrowers to throw themselves in a surprise counterattack against the British, who themselves had surprised the Germans just a few days before.
Significantly, however, von Hindenburg does not press his counterattack. He takes it only far enough to return the front line to its approximate position before the British attack. The battle ends 4 days later, after one final British withdrawal to a better defensive position. At Kursk, on the very day of the greatest tank battle of all, at Prokhorovka, Zhukov unleashes the first phase of his counterattack.
Once the Battle of Prokhorovka had been won by the Soviet Union, once the Germans were exhausted by their exertions, then the Soviet commanders could think about unleashing their troops, and they unleashed them at exactly the right moment and in exactly the right way. Very quickly, they begin to push the Germans back.
The first phase of Zhukov's counterattack is in the north of the Kursk salient. He attacks toward Orel, threatening the rear of the German 9th Army. Even before this, however, events elsewhere begin to intervene. On July 10th, 2 days before the crucial tank battle at Prokhorovka, Anglo-American forces invade Sicily. A day after Prokhorovka, Hitler informs Generals Kluge and Manstein that he is calling off Operation Citadel, his attack at Kursk, and transferring vital divisions to the west. Then, unexpectedly, to the south of the Kursk salient, Zhukov launches a second phase of his counterattack. German General von Manstein seeks to counter this by transferring much of his armor from the Kharkov area. But to the north, Zhukov checks him with a third phase of his counterattack strategy. He takes Belgorod and Orel. Then, incredibly, Zhukov unleashes a fourth counterattack towards Smolensk and Bryansk. Further south, on August 13th, Zhukov's forces enter Kharkov. Even after such success, however, Zhukov is aware of the danger of trying to achieve too much.
The Soviets at Kursk were careful not to bite off more than they could chew. Their forces were larger than many other armies would have considered necessary for the task at hand. But they preferred to be effective rather than efficient.
Their first aim, therefore, during the counter-strike at Kursk was to destroy the German formations. It was then to break out into the green fields beyond. But they knew that at that point they would have to stop. They would have to reorganize, they would have to replan, they would have to recuperate. But they knew that if they were successful at Kursk, they would have a great springboard for future offensive action.
Kursk does, in fact, provide the springboard for future Soviet offensives and to ultimate victory in 1945. But the German plan for the Hindenburg Line fails. A year after Cambrai, Germany finally loses World War I, and the guns fall silent. So how did the planners at each of these battles meet the key requirements in the battle plan for defensive battle? Objective. At Kursk, Soviet Marshal Zhukov had two very clear objectives: to stop the German army executing a pincer movement on Soviet forces in the Kursk salient, then to counterattack and destroy the Germans. At Cambrai, German Field Marshal von Hindenburg also had clear and achievable objectives. At first, to economize on his forces to effectively deal with war on two fronts. Once the British attack began, he also had a clear objective: hold up the assault until forces could be brought in for the counterattack. Intelligence. At Kursk, the Soviets had excellent intelligence. They knew full details of Hitler's plans and exploited this advantage to the full. At Cambrai, the German defenders had limited intelligence on British tanks and on the terrain over which the battle would be fought. But they had no intelligence whatever on the British attack plans. Time. At Kursk, Zhukov should not have been given the time to prepare the massive defenses which were necessary. But he was given this time because Hitler delayed the start date of the battle. At Cambrai, von Hindenburg had a whole year to plan and prepare the Hindenburg Line. Concealment. At Kursk, Zhukov and his generals managed to conceal not just their defensive positions, but also their plans to counterattack. At Cambrai and elsewhere along their defensive line, von Hindenburg and his generals deliberately did not conceal their defensive measures. Absorb attack. At Kursk, despite the incredibly bitter fighting, the Soviet defense in depth held firm. At the critical battle of Prokhorovka, losses were massive, but victory there was decisive in deciding the timing for the key final phase of defensive battle, the counterattack. At Cambrai, the German defenses were penetrated decisively on the first day, but then they soaked up and entangled the British advance sufficiently for the German counterattack phase. Realism. At Kursk, Zhukov's counterattack was detailed and ambitious, but he knew when to halt it and give his armies time to regroup and resupply. At Cambrai, von Hindenburg also knew when his counterattack had reached its limit and did not go beyond that limit. At both Kursk and Cambrai, both sets of commanders executed their battle plans for defensive battle with precision, and especially with Zhukov at Kursk, absolute ruthlessness. But what of the battle plan for defensive battle in the future?
Whilst the defensive battle plan will always have a future in military operations, it will perhaps take a relatively bold commander and a bold politician to actually sanction that sort of an operation, because it demands the attacker to come onto the defender. It may look to the population as though the army is losing the battle, and whether the population will lend its support is certainly a matter for debate.
In the West, the political and military circumstances no longer exist for commanders to conduct a true defensive battle. But even in those regions where it is possible, one thing is certain. The world is very unlikely ever to see another defensive battle of such a scale and ferocity as those along the Hindenburg Line, or especially